This is episode 118 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, as usual, there is plenty to discuss, and I guess I'll start things off by talking about a trip I made up to the Four Corners and Farmington area last week. I always enjoy going up there. Had a couple of different presentations to make to a Rotary Club as well as to the Federation of Republican Women. Did some radio interviews as well, and had the pleasure, distinct pleasure, I might add, to go to the P&M meeting that happened to be in Farmington on Tuesday of last week, at which P&M made a case again, very similar to the first time with a few changes. And of course, the Farmington Four Corners community being much more intimately involved in the whole discussion over the Energy Transition Act and changes coming to shut down San Juan Generating Station. A lot of very interested people up there in the Four Corners on that particular issue. And Wally, before I go to you for your additional comments, it is notable that the folks at P&M, after my first round of blog posting and commentary on the costs and where they're going to come up with the savings that they allege that they're going to generate by shutting down San Juan Generating Station, they specifically made a point of putting in a additional slide into their presentation. They referenced a social media individual, not naming any names. Yes, it was probably our efforts that caused them to actually do this. And the slide claims $379 million in savings out of shutting down San Juan Generating Station over the next 20 years. So I referenced this in a subsequent blog posting. Second P&M presentation only raises more question about the cost of Energy Transition Act because, of course, $4.678 billion is what they list as the real number for the cost of shutting down the system and doing the ETA. $379 million, if you not too great with math, that's a less than a tenth of the $4.678 billion. And I received a comment on this posting from Raymond G. Sandoval, Esquire, some role or whatever with P&M. He says the $4.678 billion is a $379 million savings versus continuing to run and maintain the San Juan Generating Station for the next 20 years. The cost of continuing down that path would be $4.678 million or billion, $4.678 billion plus $379 million, so $5 billion. He claims the whole plan will be reducing costs to customers. Now, doesn't go into any details, no explanation of exactly how this would happen. But Wally, we've got P&M's attention.
Well, and you should. Let me just start out by saying, to say something would cost $379 million less, you have to be highly confident about what that thing you're comparing it to would cost and what the cost of you're going to be replacing it. It's math. A minus B equals C. In the case of what San Juan would cost to run for 30 years, I believe, to the best of my knowledge, they're relying on data provided in their integrated resource plan that was heavily challenged, not really ever ruled upon by the commission. They're like, well, that's what P&M says. That's what it is. And so, will it be less than this hypothetical would have been? We don't know. But the bigger question is that hypothetical would have been number even been examined to any great degree? And I don't believe it will or has been. And then the real question is, are rates going to go up? You know, this whole argument that PNM's making reminds me a lot of when in Washington, when they actually used to care about the budget, they would say that, well, government spending's growing at 7%, so we're going to only grow it at 5%, so therefore that's a cut. Well, no, it's a slowing of a growth. I'm not convinced that we won't see higher rates despite all of these statements by PNM, because they said on their website that rates would probably go up at one point in the last year. Now, I've not looked at that recently. And so it's one of those when you're comparing two hypothetical futures and saying one's going to be lower, that's all well and good. What ratepayers care about are the prices going up or aren't they? And they seem really hesitant and unwilling to deal with that in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and to Mr. Sandoval's point, I wrote him a response comment. I appreciate your comment. So all I'm asking for is a detailed explanation of the overall savings in Plan 1. That is the one that we're talking about. PNM has 4 plans, one of which is really their preferred plan. And I said I saw a general explanation of the $379 million. But at this point, all we've seen is a lot of numbers. Where do the cost savings come from, and where are the additional costs incurred? And they have, in this slide that they showed us, and I took a photo of and put up on our website, you see capital costs $277 million, or $127 million, fuel costs $230 million, and then CO2 and other costs $27 million. I'm not sure where they get that kind of cost for carbon dioxide, given the current situation. But anyway, it was a lovely trip up to Farmington. People up there, more broadly speaking, are obviously very concerned about the shutdown of this plant. They are eagerly working to address systemic economic issues in their area of the state, trying to make themselves more attractive to businesses. It's a real challenge. It's a pretty isolated place geographically, no interstates, very indirect plane service. Durango's an hour up the road, but Farmington is working on getting some more flights. Did have a very nice time in a uniquely New Mexico-oriented setting. The Connie Mack World Series was going on, which is a big deal up in that area. Connie Mack, it's a form of select baseball, very high-level teams playing, and the community really gets behind them. So just kind of working to get some information from them up there in the Four Corners, understand where they're coming from, and trying to do the same to make sure that they know that we're working on this issue. Of course, Rio Grande Foundation, is worth repeating, is not bought into we have to keep San Juan Generating Station open. That is not our philosophy. Our philosophy is whatever in real terms the market decides, that is individuals who are concerned about costs, they're concerned about steady electricity and being able to turn on the light bulb when they want to. And they are also in many cases concerned about environmental issues, that those three are all weighted together in real terms, not some political calculation, but in a balanced price format where actual money is being transacted and discussed. It's easy to make a political stink and get politicians to jump to one side or the other, but whatever happens, the ratepayers of New Mexico and the taxpayers in New Mexico should be protected, and that's where we come down. So some daylight there between us and our friends in San Juan County on the details of the issues, but definitely they appreciate our being there and working to make this issue a statewide issue of concern. Yeah,
and you really gave a very wonderful outline about the weaknesses of cost of service regulation, is that, the regulators hold huge sway. There's very interesting incentives for the utilities to hold forth. The process, presents itself as one of economics and law. But in the final analysis, a lot of, it seems to me over the years, public regulation costs have been boiled down to basically politics and innuendo. And there's a hard time arguing that it's coming up with better answers than maybe a market solution would be. But that is the system that, many utilities across the nation operate under. And we have a huge exposure to that here with PNM and the New Mexico Public Regulatory Commission.
You got it, Wally. And speaking of being costs being borne elsewhere and incurred for a different group of people, the Albuquerque Journal had their seemingly annual now report on the decline of ridership on the Rail Runner. They measure this on a fiscal year basis, so looking at the end of June being the end of the year, so to speak, for Rail Runner ridership. Boy, it is one of those things. I think that if you can ever say that the Rio Grande Foundation got out its proverbial crystal ball and looked into the future on any issue, and we've nailed a number of them, but the Rail Runner, boy, that is one that we just saw as an impending disaster for the state of New Mexico. And, despite the fact that heavy subsidies are being given to the Rail Runner and were given to construct the thing, more will be given for the positive train control and new federal regulation on train safety. Rail Runner ridership is just dropping and dropping and dropping. The latest data show a 3% drop from 2018 to 2019. We're down from slightly over 1 million folks riding the train back in 2013 to 763,428 in fiscal year 2019. Now, the data are wonderful and they're, challenging for the Rail Runner. Of course, with the current administration, the current legislature, there will be no action, unfortunately, on the Rail Runner. We pushed very hard for the Martinez administration to do something. They did not, alas, and this boondoggle on wheels keeps rolling down the tracks. One of the funny things has been that in past years, you would hear, well, New Mexico's weak economy has caused ridership to decline. Okay, well, now the economy is considerably stronger, doing fairly well. And Terry Doyle, director of the Rio Metro Regional Transit District, says broad economic changes have contributed to the decline in Rail Runner ridership. The state has added jobs since the Great Recession, but much of the growth is in the service industry, healthcare, and education, fields that don't offer the typical 9-to-5 schedule and a predictable commute. Now, what jobs, Wally? This is a pop quiz. What jobs offer a 9-to-5 schedule and a predictable commute and also happen to be easily accessible from Albuquerque in Santa Fe?
Okay, we don't have time for me to hum the entire Final Jeopardy song, but I'm going to say, Alex, what is state, local, and federal government jobs?
Ding, ding. Wally, you should be the next Albuquerquean on Final Jeopardy. I think we have a winner here. Yes. Any additional thoughts? There's some more to talk about, but I want to get your 2 cents on the Rail Runner here.
Well, a couple of things is that in your errors of enchantment, you link to the transit is rapidly declining all over the nation because it is just not a good solution to the problem that faces working Americans right now. So something to be that heavily subsidized. And then the final one, and I think in terms of going over the problems with rail in general that has been well discussed on this podcast and by the Rio Grande Foundation, one thing that really does work very well to reduce transit that is very environmentally friendly that no one ever talks about is using GoToMeeting or Zoom or other products like that for remote working where people can still collaborate and work. And guess what? It doesn't require hundreds of millions of dollars of government subsidies. It just requires a small monthly fee and a computer and a connection, and you can do that. So we will see. Will this trend continue? I will go out on a limb and say, yeah, I don't think we've seen the bottom of rail runner commuting. We haven't seen the last of it. This thing has not bottomed out.
Yeah, as you alluded to in the blog posting, of course, goes into some detail. It's not just the rail runner. It's not just New Mexico. You can find plenty of articles out there about transit systems all across our great country, seeing collapsing ridership on their transit systems. But the Albuquerque Journal pointed out that municipal bus systems in Albuquerque and Santa Fe reported 5% drop in ridership in the 2019 fiscal year. And Las Cruces, they won the day with only a 3% decline. Yay, Las Cruces. And it noted that construction along Central Avenue in Albuquerque, the city's busiest transit corridor, contributed to the decline. I don't know what that construction might have been for along Central, but yes, we're building another wasteful bus system in Albuquerque to take an ever diminishing number of people along because, well, that is what government in New Mexico seems to do, is to waste copious quantities of your tax dollars. It's just, I don't know. It's really frustrating. And that's kind of the broader point I made in the blog posting was it's time to cut our losses. It's time to at least stop investing more taxpayer dollars in these transit systems because it's clear the trend is long-term. It's down. Isaac Benton, city councilor, says, well, low gas prices are without a question a factor in the short-term ridership trends. Well, I got news for you, pal. Lower gas prices are a long-term thing here in New Mexico, around the country, because of the fracking boom that, is fueling the state's economy. Thank you very much. Oh, boy. So we could just go on and on and on. But the fact is that it's just not really exciting for most people in New Mexico to ride transit, and it's becoming substantially less of an activity that people undertake on a regular basis. Yeah,
and then one final point I'd like to make is when we're running these largely empty buses around Albuquerque, some of them the double-length articulated buses, and when we're running 3 train cars up to Santa Fe, a lot of times with just a handful of people, even it's better for the environment that individual cars, that falls away very, very quickly. You need more than 3 people on a double-length bus, plus the driver, to make that more economical than everyone driving their own car. And so we have that issue to contend with all the other fiscal and financial issues that are presented.
Yeah, and I think that is that's obviously very true. And I would just conclude the conclusion by saying that, to me, the left's fascination and obsession with transit is not about the environment, never really has been about the environment. They want to change, i.e. control our behaviors. Automobiles provide way too much independence and ability for people to go wherever they want, whenever they want, and not have to tell anybody in the government about it. And Lyft and Uber are just additional components of that. I think Lyft and Uber are big parts of what's going on in transit declines, but it's not just those ride sharing services. If you're commuting from Albuquerque to Santa Fe on a train, you're not doing Lyft and Uber as a replacement for that. That's just not possible. I would agree, actually. We've seen, especially under Susana Martinez, a decline in state government employment overall. I think that's a healthy thing for our state's economy. Whether Michelle Lujan Grisham will bring those people back and expand the bureaucracy again, and how much of that will wind up with transit ridership increasing, those are all open questions. I mean, she's only been here in office for 6 months, so about half of this fiscal year. But that is an open question. They're going to incentivize it. They're going to try as hard as they can because they're so invested in this concept of mass transit. Unfortunately, for them, the trends nationwide are running contrary. People just don't have the time or interest in mass transit these days. Our old buddy, Tom Udall, is putting forth legislation that in many ways would devastate the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. I often don't talk about federal issues, but heck, Steve Terrell from the Santa Fe New Mexican gave me a call and wanted to talk about Citizens United, so I provided him a quote for the story. You can find it in the New Mexican. It was the July 29th edition, and I believe it's at least dated July 29th. This is a piece of legislation that would overturn the Citizens United decision, which gave corporations and unions the ability to engage in public policy campaigns, electoral campaigns. We just take the position of the ACLU. What can I say? Wally, I'll read directly from the ACLU's website statement on Citizens United. It is useful to remember that the mixture of money and politics long predates Citizens United and would not disappear even if Citizens United were overruled. Our system of free expression is built on the premise that people get to decide what speech they want to hear. It is not the role of government to make that decision for them. The ACLU at least has been right on this issue. They've had tremendous pressure placed on them by the far left to massage and diminish their position. But the ACLU was right on this particular issue, and it's about free speech. And if the media treated Tom Udall the way they treat many Republicans and the president, they would headline the story, Tom Udall pushes for repeal of large swaths of the First Amendment, and that would be a much less attractive headline. But that is exactly what he's attempting to do. He is opposing free speech.
And Paul, I have a question for you on the Citizens United. I understand how the far left really doesn't like corporations. Is there anything in this legislation, have you gotten into it far enough to know whether it would preclude unions from doing the same thing, or is this just on the the ownership side? Because that is one of the huge issues, is that with regard to free speech, they don't seem to mind unions, which is an organization, a collective of people banding together to push forth an agenda, but they certainly don't like corporations to do that.
Yeah, I don't know about the specific legislation itself, because corporations and unions and even governments are all basically organized the same. You go, from town to town and you see those signs, incorporated in blank, blank year, whatever that may be. Well, that is a form of corporation. The city, the town, county, whatever you live in is a form of a corporation. And it's the same for unions. They're just under a different bylaw when it comes to how they are organized. I don't know that Udall could, if he wanted to, write legislation that is able to pluck unions out and preserve their rights. So I'm going to go with no, tentatively, on that, not because he doesn't support unions and their ability to engage, which of course they engaged long before Citizens United, and they have engaged effectively after Citizens United. The fact is that it becomes very, very difficult to write laws to carefully pick and choose, in this case, the groups that you want to engage in the political process and those you may not. And on the flip side, though, even since Citizens United was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, corporations, you have to admit, have gotten quite a bit more on the progressive side of things when it comes to major public policy issues. And, Nike and this whole, one recent incident with the Betsy Ross flag shoes, no, they're not giving money to anybody, but they are engaged in a form of corporate speech. And I just don't see how you can rightfully carve out an area, in this case, corporations speaking on issues of national concern and political concern directly in an election, as opposed to what corporations so often do one way or the other by releasing videos, by having people like Colin Kaepernick engaged with them, and then subsequently deciding to abandon an entire line of shoes simply because you have a political axe to grind. So it's, I just think this whole discussion about Citizens United is something that needs to go away. But Tom Udall will be going away in the not too distant future. So maybe
this issue, maybe it will, maybe it won't. It seems like for many groups politically, this is almost one of those just call to action words where I'm not even sure they know what it means anymore. They just throw that out there, and their followers say, yeah, that should be gotten rid of. No
doubt about it. And Wally, I'll toot our own horn here at the Rio Grande Foundation for just a second, because and I'll toot President Trump's horn as well, because he picked William Perry Penley to head up the Bureau of Land Management recently. And the media are wasting no time in reporting this as an opponent of public lands, managing public lands, and the Bureau of Land Management is a big presence here in New Mexico. They oversee 250 million acres of public land and minerals across our great nation, most of it here in the west of, say, Oklahoma or Texas. So really we're talking about New Mexico and the Rocky Mountain West into Alaska, those parts of the country. William Perry Penley was a speaker 2 years ago at a Rio Grande Foundation event. He's been an attorney at the Mountain States law firm, and it's a public interest law firm that deals with government overreach in the area of public lands. And I don't know what his true position is in terms of the lands, but I would agree with folks who say that the Bureau of Land Management, those lands by and large should be returned either to the state or private hands. We're not talking about national parks here. Bureau of Land Management are kind of the bottom tier of lands. You got national forests. Those are pretty. They're still under Department of Agriculture, but Bureau of Land Management is largely still, thankfully, managed for revenue generation. There are multiple purposes with those lands, but when you think of BLM lands, you're not thinking Yosemite and Yellowstone. These are lovely open grasslands, flat, wide open spaces, but it is a lot of uses that the environmental community doesn't like, and really you just get into a situation where the federal government is slowing down permits and management of these lands for oil and gas that could otherwise be done effectively and environmentally. So William Perry Penley hopefully will be able to cut through some of this red tape, but ultimately I think he's right. His previous self is right, even if he's now managing these lands, is that the Bureau of Land Management, much of their holdings would be better off in private hands, or at least at the state land offices in these western states. Wally?
Well, just historically, the whole idea of how the federal government was going to be funded, there once was a time when land sales were a pretty big part of it. Enter the income tax, and that seemed like that moved to a much different point of view. And to your point is that these lands are administered by the federal government with all of the inefficiency and cumbersomeness that comes with that. There's many counties in New Mexico that are predominantly Forest Service or BLM land. They have virtually no private land holdings. Therefore, property taxes basically don't raise them any money. And there are some in lieu of property taxes that the federal government pays. So it's not like these lands, even with the revenue they generate, it's not all money to the federal government, to the federal treasury. There's lots of costs. And one of the biggest costs is probably inefficiency. If you look at a place like Texas compared to New Mexico, virtually no public land, federal public land in Texas compared to New Mexico, and just how the state operates, you can see might be one of those tragedy of the commons situation that might be much better where some of these lands moved into private holdership. But, just reading the comments from the link to this article in the General Post, the comment was, "This land is our land and it is not for sale." So it's that collectivism, collective ownership of something is the highest and best use, not proven to always be the case. In the case of BLM, maybe selling some of these lands back to the state, transferring the control of the state would be a very positive thing for our country and for New Mexico if that were indeed to happen.
Yeah, and I know environmentalists often, they like the one-stop shopping of being able to control things out of Washington, D.C., but, a lot of these lands aren't particularly well managed by the federal government, and it would be nice if the environmentalists really feel strongly about some of these lands and managing them for their purposes. They can buy them too if they would wind up in the private sector and sold somehow. I think that is a much more effective way than having Washington, D.C. bureaucrats manage these lands. And a quick note, the BLM, according to this article, manages 1 out of every 10 acres in the United States. That is an amazing statistic. Clearly a much, much higher proportion here in New Mexico because, as I said, very little federal lands, and the other states starting, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. And then 30% of the nation's minerals are on BLM land. So Mr. William Perry Penley, former Rio Grande Foundation speaker 2 years ago, he is going to be managing a lot of lands and has a position of significant sway there in Washington, D.C., thanks to the Trump administration.
Yeah, and then just a final, specific point to New Mexico. When you talk about minerals includes oil and natural gas. Huge amounts of oil and natural gas production are on Bureau of Land Management leases, subject to Bureau of Land Management rules. So that is definitely a big impact, practically speaking, now and into the foreseeable future for our state.
Sat down over the weekend with Jeannie Nugan at Channel 13, and hopefully folks who didn't see that because maybe they have DirecTV. Oh, there's a big fight going on with the Channel 13 and DirecTV. So you and I, customers of DirecTV, are not able to receive Channel 13 through our systems, but you can go online to their website or go to airsofenchantment.com. The city of Albuquerque has a transparency site, ABQ The View. It's been a generally good thing, well maintained, and a lot of benefits to having that kind of data readily accessible. But on the issue of some of these transparency items, categories, things put up on the website, 84 million on unclassified items and more than 67 million on miscellaneous items. Now, when you go online and try to do some research and dig into what the city is spending its money on, it doesn't do a heck of a lot for you to find 84 million in unclassified items and 67 million in miscellaneous items. That is exactly what this is not supposed to be all about. According to the city in this story, unclassified expenses range from utilities, tort claims, and economic development incentives. Miscellaneous expenses are construction, because that's very different. You got to keep the unclassified and the miscellaneous very separate, Wally. It's really important. The miscellaneous expenses are construction projects, part of the capital expenditure projects of the city, even though they already have a category for construction projects. And the city says, what we really have is a reporting issue. And I think that would be a duh. So a year and a half in, a little more than that, the Keller administration still getting their sea legs on this transparency site. They claim they're going to get things all squared away, but kudos to Channel 13, and thanks for asking yours truly to be on this particular story and offer some views and additional content for them. But yeah, transparency is only good if you are actually updating and classifying the information correctly, Wally.
Absolutely. What'd you spend the money on? Stuff. Various, sundry, miscellaneous, and other. Yeah, not a lot of information there. Hopeful sign, they said that they're maybe paring down the number of categories in this same report from 9,000 to 300, which still seems a lot. Maybe make it a little easier. This will be an interesting one to put a note on the calendar and check back in a year and see what the result is.
Yeah, and again, there are plenty of cities, there's plenty of counties, there's plenty of universities and colleges all over this great state that could benefit greatly, and the citizens of our state could benefit greatly from having basic transparency information up on their websites. We need to not only push for that, but push for that information to be updated on a regular basis and made as clear as possible. And the city of Albuquerque, like I said, does a pretty decent job overall. Unfortunately, not in this area. And finally, Wally, an under the radar issue that we've been kind of looking at the foundation. Out of the last session, there were a number of bills that I know a lot of folks around our state would like to have seen put up on a ballot referendum. And not much has been reported of this except patriot groups on one side working to get approval for the language for the ballot, with the Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, who is also running far to the left of Ben Ray Lujan for the U.S. Senate. She is swatting them down much like a volleyball player at the net. Just every time one of these petitions comes up, she bats it to the ground. And right now, as of this past week, a lawsuit has been filed by attorney Blair Dunn, also happened to be the 2018 Libertarian candidate for Attorney General and something of a liberty-minded lawyer trying to file lawsuits all over the place, keeping politicians in place. So there was an attempt to get signatures for up to 10 new laws. 2 of those are gun reform issues. They might not fall under the ability to collect referendums and put them on the ballot because they do apply to public safety, which is an area specifically peeled out of New Mexico's referendum process. But even if these lawsuits are successful, or this lawsuit is successful, long way to go before we see these referendums on the ballot. New Mexico's only had 2 in the history of the state make the ballot. It's very onerous signature requirements. You see some of these other states, Colorado, California, you just have every election 10, 12, 15 or more issues on the ballot. A lot of really important things are decided in direct democracy, for better or for worse. And New Mexico is not a state that's really ever had a lot of direct democracy. So this would be a big sea change. But I think it's really important to note and clarify that seems like Maggie Toulouse-Oliver is being pretty darn partisan here in the way she's swatting down these proposals, and we'll see where the lawsuit goes and whether there is an ability to get Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, Secretary of State, to get off the schneid and approve some of these. And then the very difficult challenge of collecting signatures and getting them on the ballot would follow.
Yeah, it would. If I am with you, reading the Constitution for what it says, which is a dangerous exercise in and of itself because of the mental gymnastics that sometimes goes into interpreting a Constitution, even that of the state of New Mexico, where it talks about that doesn't apply to public safety laws. Even my humble, simple, common sense interpretations is that might apply. But I do think the point is that should any of these get the go-ahead, it would be very interesting to see what sort of apparatus would be in play. Would they be able to get the signatures to put that back for direct democracy? And then the final thought is that direct democracy, we are a representative republic. The places that have a lot of it in the United States are not necessarily those that have the best governance. There's a little long state to the left of New Mexico, both literally and figuratively. As you look at the map, has a lot of ballot initiatives and a lot of crazy stuff happens there. But this whole issue about people very upset, believing that these laws are unconstitutional, what the federal Constitution wanted to do something about it in New Mexico, there is still a lot of attention being brought to that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, and there's a long list, obviously, 10 different referendums out there being considered. It brought a specific smile to my face that HB 85, that is the right to work repeal bill that successfully repealed our efforts to advance right to work at the county level all around our state. That is one of the bills being considered by the patriot groups for a referendum. There are a number of others, and it's just going to be one of those things. What do the courts have to say? Are the courts going to give this one at least a fair shake? I hope they do. I think it's important that as a Secretary of State, you can't just swat down any application for a referendum that you don't like. And that's an important principle. You don't have, the whole referendum process is to get around the politicians to an extent. And if a politician's just personally in disagreement with your efforts, well, that's not really part of the system, whether you like democracy direct or not. Yeah, and just to bookend the analog to your opening, there was the Geico TV commercial where Dikembe Mutombo, the 7'6", we're blocking these initiatives. And so Secretary of State Mutombo continues to have a perfect record blocking these, and we will see what the courts say about many of these, if any of them make it through. Well, I think Mutombo may speak French, and she has a French-sounding last name, so that may be the second similarity between Mutombo and Maggie Toulouse-Oliver. So, all right. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.